Hi guys, it's Annie here. Today I'm going to be talking to you about graphite and doing a little demo on different types of mark making techniques. So going into graphite, I think it is one of the most commonly used drawing materials. When you go into drawing, usually most people start with graphite, so it's pretty familiar to all of us. Let's get started. So graphite pencils sort of vary in range of softness and hardness, H standing for hardness and B standing for blackness or softness. So on one side of the scale, you've got, you've got 4H here. So this is gonna be your hardest and your lightest pencil. So I have a little square filled in with 4H here. And as I fill this in and feel the lead, it feels like it has less give, that it holds its point better because it is a harder lead, and that, as you can see, the darkest dark I get from really pressing hard here is still not going to be very dark. If I go to the other side of the spectrum, so we're talking 6 speed now, you're going to have your blackest, your softest, your darkest lead. So if I color in the square here, I can feel that the lead has a lot more give. It's a lot softer. And as you can kind of see by this comparison, the darkest dark I get here is a lot darker than the 4H I have used over here. So the darkest I can get with the 4H. If you're having trouble getting your darkest darks in a graphite drawing, I would recommend that you reevaluate the range of pencils you're using. So if you're sort of sticking to the H side or just using like an HB pencil, which is a typical writing pencil, you're probably not going to be able to get your darkest darks just because of the nature of the lead itself. So as hard as you press, you're still not going to get this same dark value as you can with a 6B pencil when you're using an HB. All right. So that is that for sort of these typical wood pencils. Another great tool to use in graphite drawings is compressed graphite. And this is something I actually also stumbled upon in freshman year. And it's basically a big stick of graphite, so there's no wood involved. And because it's a lot thicker, you can cover, and just like more lead itself is exposed, you can cover a lot more area with it. So like this, if I want to shade in like a really large area in a graphite drawing, like one way to do it would just be to cover the area with like a flat graded value, right? And I can even use like something to smudge it. You can use a tissue. You might be able to use your finger. I would say that you should be careful with using your finger because sometimes the finger oils can affect the way things smudge, and you can also get fingerprints. Another good tool to use is maybe like a blending stump or a cloth. Those can also be great alternatives. So moving on to mark making. Let's see. So talking about basic mark making, I feel like most of you're probably pretty familiar with this kind of mark making, but you've got your sort of basic, let me see if I can grab one. All right, so you've got hatching, which is just really one directional mark. And then you've got cross hatching, which is when you go over this one directional mark with another direction, right? And you've got this sort of like checkered or angled kind of shading. You can do scumbling, which is like more scribbly or more gestural. You can also do stippling, so this kind. And there are so many different marks sort of in between all of these. I would really just recommend that you be really exploratory and really open with experimenting with these materials. And you'll find that mark making can be a really great way to express your own sensibilities and your own personality through your work. So Another tip for mark making is that it doesn't always have to be like a pattern. So, or like very one-dimensional. So we can use mark making in this more atmospheric way of sort of, I don't know, filling in a background with more movement or something else, which is a great way to use mark making. But another way to use it would be to maybe describe the form of a material, so, or the texture of it. So what I'm saying is that mark making can be a lot more descriptive, and it can be a way of adding description to something while also adding personality to your work. So maybe if I'm, I don't know, drawing some weird vase here. Forgive my perspective, I'm trying to draw this really fast. If I want to describe the way that something curves, I can definitely use mark for that. Like maybe I'm going to use like a more curved mark that follows sort of the contours of this shape. And this way, I think it's a lot more interesting than if you were to just sort of smudge your way through describing this form. You've got movement, you've got sort of added sense of sensibility or style, and it's just a lot more visually interesting, in my opinion. So, moving on to the graphite stick, you can also create a lot of really interesting marks, especially because you're using a stick and not this like tiny little point of a pencil. You can get a lot more dynamicism with your marks. So if you want to create like a really organic or craggly line that varies in line weight or in line thickness, line width, I guess, it's a great tool to use. And you can also get like, if you use the flat part, you can get like these flatter but more narrow shaded areas. And you can also get like, if you apply pressure onto like the point, maybe you want like something that's shaded but also harder on the edge. And these are all things you can get with a graphite stick. It's also great for adding more movement and dynamicism into your work. Just because of the nature of the stick itself, it requires that sort of you hold it in a different way than you might a pencil. So maybe I'm holding the pencil the way I use, the way I write, and I'm doing this kind of work, versus if I'm using the stick, I have to use this like overhand technique, right? And this will affect the way that I make marks. And that's actually something that's great to apply to using a pencil, because like that's not the only way you can use a pencil, right? You can also use this overhand technique and you can get a lot more gestural marks. Or you can hold your hand further from the tip of the lead itself, and that way you get this larger radius. So you can create larger strokes without compromising on control. Or you could hold it like a stick and do this kind of more gestural work. These are all very like different ways to use a pencil or a stick, but varying the way you hold it can also change the way you approach mark. So lastly, I'd like to talk about subtractive mark. So subtractive mark is sort of in contrast to additive mark. It's when you're taking away from the page. You're taking away from whatever values on the paper. So a great way to do this is with an eraser. So you've got like your netted eraser and then maybe like a block eraser, or here, I don't have a block eraser on me, so I'm using the back of a mechanical pencil. So let me make an area of darker here. You can see that we've already made this darker area. I'm gonna smudge it again. And the great thing about a netted eraser for subtractive mark is that you can sort of sculpt it into whatever kind of imprint you want, right? So I can sculpt it into a point and get some like really soft subtractive marks, or maybe I want to sculpt it into like a little circle or disc and go in and create these more circular subtractive marks. And I find that when you use a kneaded eraser, you're going to get a lot softer of subtractive mark than if you're using like a regular harder eraser. So here, as you can see, I can get sort of these really much harder marks, and you can get probably smaller ones too. So this is great when you're trying to describe like highlights on a certain form, or maybe the way the light hits a certain like door handle, or like a crook of the handle of a chair or something. It's also a great way to describe like light hitting smaller areas, so like fur or like a small point. There's a lot of different ways to inventively use Subtractive Mark, and I really encourage you to sort of try this out. It's a great thing to explore in your work. The last thing I'd like to talk about is sort of this idea that graphite is, the darkest darks of graphite are different than maybe what you would get as a black with ink or paint maybe. So the nature of graphite is that the darkest darks are kind of shiny, like it itself is kind of a shiny material, and you can kind of use this to your advantage when you're working with mixed media works, in that graphite on top of black, as opposed to graphite on top of white, which is kind of dark, it just looks like dark gray. On black, it starts to get a lot more shiny. So let's see, I don't know if you can see that, but if you do this yourself, you're probably going to be able to see that graphite is reflective, and it's really noticeable, or more noticeable on black. And this way you can get a lot of subtle, really subtle shifts in tone, or maybe you want like a little secret detail in your work where as the light hits it, it shows up, or accentuates an area, or maybe even like a certain texture. Like if you were to have like a textured surface here and you rubbed over with graphite, you would capture some of those like contours in a really, really interesting way. So next, I'm going to do a demo on how to actually apply some of the techniques that we've been talking about. I'm using graphite to draw a plywood eam sculpture. I think it's quite an interesting subject because of all the different curves and contours of the form, which are really fun and interesting to capture with graphite. So first, I'm going in with a light H pencil to map out the form. This is the first step to any drawing, since committing to dark lines too early can leave you with a drawing that relies too much on line and starts looking more like an outline than a developed form. Next, I'm going in with a darker 3B pencil to map out the darkest darks in the form. This is just to give me a reference and to start defining the form a little more. Now I've started laying in some larger blocks of value and textures with a graphite stick. Now, since my piece is pretty small, the areas that I can cover are relatively more limited, but even in this piece, the graphite stick lets me cover chunks of space, and the looser nature of the tool itself adds more movement to the piece and makes it more dynamic. I've also started adding some more contour lines that mimic the plywood grain with the graphite stick. At this point, it's okay if everything isn't super precise, because the beauty of the process is that you can let go and have looser, less controlled marks that can be erased or layered in later when you're adding more detail to the drawing. Now I'm using Subtractive Mark to accentuate the contours and take away values in the drawing. I'm using a combination of subtractive and additive mark, which is a great way to work because then you can go back and work less tightly, since you can rein in any areas you've gone overboard with an eraser. Lastly, I'm using a straighter diagonal mark to add value to the background. Changing up my mark here really helps differentiate the foreground from the background, which is really useful when you're working with a lot of mid-tone values like I am here. Lastly, I'm adding in the details, some shadows, and a few finishing touches, and now I'm done. So that's the demo. So that's it for the graphite demo. I hope this was helpful, and good luck with your experimentation and exploration with graphite.